The dog shouldn't have been there. Nobody walks into Solace, the most exclusive restaurant on Chicago's Gold Coast, without a reservation, a name, and the kind of money that doesn't need to explain itself. But that Friday night, a Neapolitan Mastiff the size of a small horse dragged itself through the back kitchen door, crossed the dining room floor past frozen waiters and speechless guests, and collapsed right at the feet of Emilio Valenti, the man no one in Chicago dared look in the eye. Emilio was 36. He ran an empire that stretched from Chicago to Miami, restaurants and hotels on the surface, something far darker underneath. Every Friday he sat at the same corner table, back to the wall, eyes on both exits, cutting a steak he'd ordered without appetite. He'd been doing this for 5 years, ever since the night a phone call at 2 a.m. told him his mother's car had exploded outside her Lincoln Park home and she hadn't survived. 5 years of eating alone. 5 years of staring past the window at something that wasn't there anymore. Tommy Keene, his head of security, drew his weapon the second the dog hit the floor. Emilio raised one hand. The whole room went still. He looked down. The animal was wrecked, ribs showing through loose gray skin, breathing shallow and desperate, but its eyes were open. Dark brown, deep, completely exhausted, and not afraid. That's what got him. This dying creature had dragged itself past every person in the city and chosen to lay down at the feet of its most dangerous man. Emilio knelt. He put his hand on the dog's head, and something cracked open in his chest that he'd kept sealed shut for 5 years. Get a vet. Now. Tommy had never heard his boss speak like that. Not cold, not commanding, desperate. What Emilio didn't know yet was that this dog hadn't found him by accident. It had an owner, a woman who'd lost everything, because she carried a secret that could destroy the one person he trusted most in this world. And when she finally walked through his door, nothing in his life would ever be the same. If this story's already got you hooked, smash that like button, share it with someone who needs this tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Now let's go back to the moment Emilio Valenti knelt on that cold restaurant floor, because that's the moment everything he believed in started to fall apart. Veterinarian Petra Novak arrived at Solace close to midnight. She was the only person Tommy could find at that hour. A large animal veterinarian working at a clinic 20 minutes from the restaurant by car. When Petra stepped inside, the restaurant was already closed. The staff had all gone home. Only Emilio remained, sitting on the floor beside the dog, his hand still resting on its head, while Tommy stood watch at the door, as if guarding something more important than any deal his boss had ever made. Petra knelt down to examine it. She didn't say anything for the first few minutes. Then she looked up at Emilio with eyes he understood immediately, the eyes of someone weighing how much truth to tell. She said the dog was severely malnourished, likely hadn't been fed properly for many months. Its front left leg was badly infected, swollen, foul-smelling. If it wasn't treated within the next few days, it would lose that leg, and if it didn't receive fluids that very night, it might not survive until morning. Emilio didn't ask about the cost, didn't ask about the odds of survival. He only said to do whatever was necessary. Petra started the fluids right there on the restaurant floor. While they waited, Emilio asked what breed it was. Petra said it was a Neapolitan Mastiff, an Italian breed, rare and expensive. Someone had once cared for this dog very well before it fell into its current condition. It hadn't been a stray from the beginning. It had belonged to someone. Once the dog was stable enough to move, Emilio ordered it taken to the penthouse on Michigan Avenue. Tommy opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped. 2 other bodyguards, men far more used to seeing blood and guns than seeing their boss carry a dog, stood there in silence and watched Emilio step into the private elevator with the Neapolitan Mastiff lying on a blanket in his arms. The penthouse was on the 43rd floor. White marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the entire Chicago skyline, dark furniture, everything expensive and everything empty. Emilio set the dog down in the living room. Tommy had already sent someone to buy a luxury dog bed, the kind lined with sheepskin, and place it near the glass where the city lights cast their warmest glow. The dog looked at the bed, then turned away. It dragged itself slowly to the farthest corner of the room, the darkest place, the place the city light couldn't reach, and lay down there, its face turned toward the wall. Emilio stood and watched. He understood without anyone needing to explain. The dog was used to sleeping in dark places, hidden places, places where no one would find it. It chose the darkness, because darkness was the only safety it knew. Emilio walked to the switch and turned off every light in the penthouse. The room sank into darkness. Only the faint glow from the city outside slipped through the glass walls, enough to make out the outlines of things, but not enough to see each other's faces clearly. He sat down on the sofa near the corner where the dog lay. He didn't turn on the television, didn't pour himself whiskey, didn't make a phone call. He just sat there in the dark, listening to the animal's labored breathing less than 2 meters away. After a while, the breathing slowed, more even, softer. The dog had fallen asleep. Emilio didn't sleep. He sat there until the first light of morning began to slip through the glass walls, and the Chicago skyline shifted from black to gray, and then to pale orange. Over the past 5 years, he had sat alone in the dark on more nights than he wanted to admit. But that night was the first time he had sat in the dark and not felt alone. Tommy came in the next morning and saw that his boss was still sitting on the sofa, eyes open, while the dog still lay in the dark corner. He didn't ask anything. He only set a cup of coffee on the table and walked back out. There were some things that even the people closest to Emilio Valenti knew better than to touch. During the first week, Petra Novak came to the penthouse twice a day to change Titan's bandages, give fluids, and examine the dog's front leg. The infection began to ease on the 3rd day. The dog began eating on the 4th day, slowly and cautiously, as if it didn't fully trust that the food would still be there if it looked away. Emilio named him Titan. No one asked why. Tommy simply nodded, wrote the name into the list of things that needed to be bought for the dog, and from that moment on, everyone on the team called him by that name. But it was during Petra's care of Titan that Emilio began to notice things that weren't right. On the 5th day, when Petra checked the dog's ears, she paused longer than usual. She called Emilio over to look. Titan's left ear had an old scar, long healed, but the cut was too straight, too clean to have been an accident. Someone had cut off part of the dog's ear with a sharp instrument, deliberately, likely to remove an identifying tattoo or mark that some owners of rare breeds often used. On the 6th day, Petra found the second thing. Behind Titan's neck, beneath the thick, wrinkled skin typical of a Neapolitan Mastiff, there was a small, healed surgical scar. She felt the area carefully and confirmed it. The dog had once been implanted with an identification microchip, but the chip had been surgically removed. It hadn't fallen out naturally. It hadn't malfunctioned. Someone had taken this dog somewhere and asked to have the chip removed. The third thing Emilio discovered himself. One morning, while Titan lay on his side on the living room floor so Petra could change the bandage on his leg, Emilio noticed the mark around the dog's neck. A dark ring ran around it, and the fur there was much thinner than on the rest of his body. The mark of a collar that had been on the dog for a very long time, long enough to leave a permanent trace on the skin, and then had been cut off and thrown away. Emilio sat on the sofa looking at those 3 traces and began to piece them together. The ear had been cut to erase an identifying mark. The chip had been surgically removed, so no one could trace the dog's origin. The collar had been cut away to erase the owner's name. 3 actions, 3 purposes, 1 conclusion. Someone had deliberately erased this dog's entire identity. This wasn't an abandoned dog. This was a stolen dog, and whoever stole it didn't want anyone to find its former owner. Emilio called Tommy in. He said it simply. Find out where this dog came from, who the former owner was, and why every trace had been erased. Tommy nodded, but Emilio saw the question in his eyes. The question Tommy was wise enough not to ask out loud. Why does boss care about this so much? The answer Emilio didn't say was instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive for 20 years in the underworld. When someone goes to that much trouble to erase traces that carefully, what they're hiding is always bigger than what appears on the surface. Petra was the one who found the first lead. She explained that for rare and high-value breeds like a Neapolitan Mastiff, owners often implant a secondary backup microchip in a non-standard location, such as the hip or chest, to protect against professional theft. She performed a full-body scan and discovered a second, hidden chip near Titan's ribcage. By running that specific ID number through the National Registry, she successfully pulled up the original owner's encrypted file. It took 3 days. The result came back with one name, Hazel Brennan, an old registered address in the Bridgeport neighborhood of Chicago. Emilio ordered Tommy to pull every file they could on this woman. What came back within 24 hours formed a picture that Emilio read 3 times over. Hazel Brennan, 27 years old, former student in the Doctor of Veterinary Medicine program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. During her studies, She worked evening shifts at Southside Veterinary Clinic in Chicago to pay her tuition. 5 years earlier, she had been accused of stealing controlled medication, specifically opioids, from the clinic's drug supply. Her license had been revoked by the Illinois Department of Health. She had been expelled from the DVM program. After that, she vanished from every record. No new address, no new job, no active bank account, as if she had evaporated. Emilio set the file down on the table. He looked at Titan lying in the corner of the living room, the dark corner the dog had chosen as his sleeping place from the very first night. Something didn't fit. A person who chose to own a Neapolitan Mastiff, an expensive breed that required careful attention, a person studying to become a veterinarian, someone who clearly loved animals enough to make them a lifelong calling, and yet she stole opioids from the very place where she worked. That story didn't hold together. And in Emilio Valenti's world, when a story doesn't hold together, there's always another story being hidden behind it. He looked at Tommy. Find her. It took Tommy 4 days to find her. Not because he was bad at what he did, but because Hazel Brennan no longer existed in any system ordinary people used to find someone. No phone, no bank account, no rental address, no recent medical records. She was a ghost. Tommy had to go the old way, asking people on the street, checking shelters from the north side down to the south side of Chicago, showing the photo from her old file to shelter managers. In the end, a volunteer at a temporary shelter in Englewood recognized the face in the picture. She's here, the volunteer said, but she doesn't talk to many people. Tommy called Emilio. Emilio said bring her to the penthouse. Tommy asked what if she doesn't want to come. Emilio was silent for a moment, then said, tell her I have her dog. Tommy found Hazel on the second floor of the shelter, sitting on the lower bunk in a shared room with 7 other women. She was 27 years old but looked 35, thin enough that her shoulder bones pressed sharply beneath an oversized coat, the kind of men's winter coat someone had probably given her somewhere along the way. Her reddish-brown hair clung together, not exactly dirty but clearly not cared for properly in a long time. Dark circles under her eyes, sneakers torn at the toes, taped at the sides as a temporary fix. But when Tommy told her he had come from the man who was keeping her dog, what changed in Hazel Brennan's face wasn't fear or suspicion. It was hope, the kind of hope someone had been trying to kill inside herself for 3 years and still hadn't managed to kill. She stood up immediately. Didn't ask where they were going. Didn't ask who he was. She asked only one thing. Is he still alive? Tommy said yes. Hazel closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them and said, I'll go. On the way to the penthouse, she sat in the back seat in silence, staring out the window. Tommy watched her in the rearview mirror and noticed her hands clenched together in her lap, her knuckles white. She didn't ask a single thing about Emilio Valenti. Either she already knew who he was, or she didn't care. Both possibilities caught Tommy's attention. When the elevator opened on the 43rd floor and Hazel stepped into the penthouse, she paused for 1 beat. Only 1 beat. White marble floors beneath her torn shoes, floor-to-ceiling glass walls with the whole Chicago skyline spread behind them. Afternoon light pouring into the room and touching every expensive surface. It was another world, but Hazel didn't look at the room for more than a second, because from the dark corner on the far side of the living room, where the city light couldn't reach, there was a sound. Titan stood up, slowly, trembling, his front leg still bandaged. The dog hadn't stood up for anyone during the past 10 days. Not even Emilio. He ate where he lay, let Petra change his bandages where he lay, and moved only when absolutely necessary. But now he stood up. He looked toward the elevator doors, nose lifting to the air, and his whole body changed. The tail Emilio had never once seen wag began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. Titan walked, limping but without stopping, across the living room, through the strip of light, straight toward Hazel. Hazel dropped to her knees on the marble floor. Both knees hit the ground and she opened her arms. Titan collapsed into her chest, his huge body shaking. Hazel wrapped her arms around the dog and cried, not out loud, no sobbing, no broken sounds, only tears running down onto the dog's wrinkled gray skin while she held him tightly, as if she were afraid that if she let go, he would disappear again. She whispered into Titan's ear, her voice cracked and so quiet it was almost impossible to hear. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I looked for you everywhere. Emilio stood 3 meters away. His back rested against the dining table, his arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable. but he was watching very carefully. She wasn't holding the dog the way an owner holds a pet after a few days apart. It was the way people hold the only thing they have left in the world. He knew that embrace. He knew it because he had held his mother that way one last time in her coffin, with both arms, holding on as if he held tightly enough, time would stop. It hadn't stopped. He looked at Hazel Brennan kneeling on the floor of his penthouse, clutching the dog someone had stolen from her, crying without a sound. And he knew that whatever had happened to this woman, it was far bigger than a theft of medication accusation in some file. Hazel didn't let go of Titan for 15 full minutes. When she finally stood up, her eyes were red, her face wet, and she didn't wipe away the tears. She just stood there, one hand still resting on Titan's head, and looked at Emilio for the first time since stepping into the penthouse. It wasn't the look of someone afraid. It wasn't the look of someone begging. It was the look of someone assessing. Emilio recognized that look because he used it every day. He said, "Sit down and eat." Not an invitation, a statement, his voice flat and neutral, the kind of voice he used when he wanted someone to understand he wasn't asking for their opinion. He told Tommy to send someone up with food. 20 minutes later, the dark walnut dining table held steak, mashed potatoes, bread, water, and coffee. Hazel sat in the chair across from Emilio. Titan lay at her feet, his head resting on her torn shoes, and for the first time since arriving at this penthouse, the dog closed his eyes without lying in the dark corner. Hazel ate, but the way she ate caught Emilio's attention more than anything else she had done since walking in. She didn't eat fast, didn't stuff the food down. She cut the steak into small, even pieces, chewed slowly, swallowed slowly, and between each bite she paused for a few seconds, as if reminding herself not to eat too quickly. That was how people ate when they had grown used to not knowing where the next meal was coming from. A person who ate fast had been hungry for a few days. A person who ate that slowly had been hungry long enough to learn how to control the hunger, to know that eating too quickly after going without for too long would make the stomach turn against them. Emilio knew that. He had known it since the years he grew up on the South Side before money, before power, when dinner on many nights was whatever his mother could manage to scrape together. He didn't say anything through the entire meal. He just sat there drinking black coffee and watching. When Hazel set the knife down and dabbed her mouth with a paper napkin, she looked straight into his eyes, didn't lower her head, didn't look away, looked straight at him. "I know who you are." She said it evenly, her voice steady, not shaking but not trying to sound strong either. "Emilio Valenti. Everyone in Chicago knows that name, and I know I shouldn't be sitting here." Emilio didn't react. He set his coffee cup down on the table, leaned back in his chair, and waited. Hazel went on. "I need to tell you something. Not to trade for anything. Not because you're holding Titan, but because I owe Titan this. If it weren't for this dog, I wouldn't have had a reason to survive until today. And what I'm about to tell you is something Titan paid for with 3 years of being taken away from me." Silence. The room was so quiet Emilio could hear Titan breathing beneath the table. "This dog was stolen from me," Hazel said, each word clear and measured, "by Franco Bianchi's men." Emilio didn't move. Not one muscle in his face changed, but inside his chest, something had just turned to ice. Franco Bianchi, the brother he had grown up with on the South Side, the man who had stood beside him the night his mother died, the only man in the world Emilio Valenti trusted without needing a reason. Hazel wasn't finished. "And the reason they took Titan from me," she said, her eyes never leaving Emilio's, "is because I know Franco Bianchi killed your mother." Emilio shot to his feet. The chair crashed backward and struck the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the room. Tommy, on the far side of the room, reached for his gun on instinct. Titan startled beneath the table, but Hazel didn't move. She sat there, dark green eyes lifted to Emilio as he stood over her, his jaw locked, the vein in his neck standing out. Her eyes were exhausted but not afraid. The same kind of eyes Titan had on that first night collapsed at Emilio's feet, worn out but not afraid. "Say that again," Emilio said, his voice so low Tommy had to lean in to hear it clearly. "Franco Bianchi killed your mother." Hazel repeated it without changing her tone. 5 years ago, the car explosion in Lincoln Park. It wasn't a fuel leak. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was Franco. Emilio placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. "Evidence. Just one word." Hazel nodded slowly. "Your mother, Renata, discovered that Franco was laundering money for the Sinaloa cartel through the chain of restaurants that you and Franco co-owned. She found the real books, recordings of phone calls between Franco and cartel people, and the Cayman Islands account numbers. She collected all of it. She was going to tell you. Franco found out and moved first. Emilio closed his eyes. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then he opened them and looked at Hazel with the kind of gaze that anyone who knew him would recognize instantly. The gaze people saw just before they died because of him, right before everything ended. How do you know all of this? Hazel didn't answer right away. She looked down at Titan beneath the table, touched the dog's head lightly as if drawing courage from him, then began to speak. 6 years ago, she was in her final year of the Doctor of Veterinary Medicine program at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. DVM tuition wasn't cheap, and her family had no money. Her mother died when she was 14, and her grandmother Dolores raised her in a small apartment in Bridgeport on a pension and night shifts at a laundromat. To make ends meet, Hazel took evening shifts at Southside Veterinary Clinic, the kind of shift no student wanted because it ended at 11 at night in an area where no one wanted to walk alone. One evening in October, a woman came into the clinic just before closing with a tabby cat in a plastic carrier. She was somewhere in her 60s, with short silver hair, wearing a dark blue wool coat, speaking in a voice with a slight rasp that Hazel later learned came from 20 years of smoking before she quit. The cat only had a mild ear infection, nothing serious. But the woman stayed at the clinic for another 45 minutes after the exam was over. She sat in the waiting room and talked with Hazel about everything. About the weather, about the cat, about the neighborhood. When she left, she said thank you for listening, her voice a little softer, as if that was something she didn't have much of. Her name was Renata Valenti. Hazel stopped there, looked at Emilio. He was still standing motionless, both hands braced on the table, his eyes never leaving her. The next week Renata came back, Hazel continued. No appointment, no sick cat. She brought a box of homemade cannoli and said she had baked too many and couldn't finish them. She sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, talking with Hazel between patients. From then on, it became a habit. Every week, on Tuesday night, Renata came to Southside Veterinary Clinic with a box of cannoli or biscotti, or sometimes just 2 coffees from the cafe near her house. She sat in the waiting room and talked about her childhood in Sicily, about her late husband, about her son, whom she loved more than her own life, but didn't know how to tell because he was busy, because he was always busy, because the world he lived in had no place for the kind of love she wanted to give him. Hazel didn't say Emilio's name, but both of them knew who she meant. Emilio clenched his jaw but didn't interrupt. Hazel said Renata became someone she hadn't known she needed until she had her. Her mother had died when she was too young to understand it fully, and her grandmother Dolores loved her with everything she had. But she was old, she was tired, she no longer had the strength to both raise Hazel and be her emotional anchor. Renata filled that empty space, not loudly, not with declarations, only by showing up every Tuesday night with cannoli and her presence. She became the spiritual mother Hazel had lost at 14. Then everything changed. About 3 months before Renata died, she came to the clinic on a night that wasn't Tuesday. She didn't bring cannoli. Her face was different, tense, her eyes red. She sat down in the waiting room and told Hazel she had discovered something about her son's business, something she couldn't tell him yet because she didn't know who in his circle could be trusted. She said she had found double books in Franco Bianchi's office when she went to clean the company office over the weekend, something she often did because she liked feeling close to her son's work. She said the books showed Franco moving hundreds of millions of dollars through the restaurant chain Emilio and Franco co-owned, money that didn't come from revenue but from the Sinaloa cartel. She said she had recorded 4 phone calls between Franco and cartel people on an old phone. She said she had found Cayman Islands account numbers matching the money flow. She said she had copied everything onto a hard drive. Then Renata took Hazel's hand and said, "Keep this for me. Guard it with your life. Don't give it to anyone unless something happens to me. And if it does, find a way to get it to Emilio." Hazel took the hard drive. 3 months later, Renata's car exploded in Lincoln Park. Hazel stopped, breathed. Titan beneath the table lifted his head and looked at her as if he could feel the weight in her voice. After Renata died, she continued, "I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know you, didn't know anyone in your world. And then everything started collapsing. 2 weeks after Renata's funeral, Southside Veterinary Clinic was hit with a surprise inspection from the Illinois Department of Health. They found controlled opioid medication missing from the supply. The trace records pointed to Hazel, her evening shifts, her employee code. She was accused of stealing the drugs. Her license was revoked within 48 hours. She was expelled from the DVM program. No lawyer would take the case because she had no money to pay. She lost her job, her home, her future in less than 2 months. Then, 3 years ago, they came for Titan, Hazel said, her voice dropping for the first time since she began speaking. 2 men came into the temporary apartment where I was staying as a favor from someone I knew. They held me down and took Titan away. They didn't say a word. That was the final warning. Stay quiet, forget it, or next time it won't be the dog. I understood the message, but I didn't forget, and I didn't give up the hard drive. She looked at Emilio. 5 years, she said. I kept it for 5 years. Sewn into the lining of this coat. Slept with it every night. Lost everything except that. Because Renata told me to guard it with my life, and that was the only thing my second mother ever asked me to do. No one said anything for a while after Hazel finished. Emilio was still standing, both hands braced on the table, his eyes lowered to the wood surface without truly seeing anything. Tommy stood in the corner of the room, his hand still near his gun, his gaze moving back and forth between Hazel and his boss as if he were trying to decide something no one had yet asked him to decide. Then Hazel stood up. She took off the oversized coat, the men's winter coat she had worn for who knew how long, and turned the inside outward. On the left side of the lining, near the bottom seam, there was a line of hand stitching, uneven, rough, clearly sewn with an ordinary needle and thread rather than a machine. Hazel used her fingers to break the thread. The fabric opened, and she pulled from inside it a small external hard drive, the kind no bigger than half a hand, wrapped in a Ziploc bag that had yellowed with time. She placed it on the table between them. Emilio looked at the hard drive, a tiny object, worn, old, so light it barely seemed to matter. But he knew what was inside it carried more weight than anything he had ever held. He picked it up, his hand shook. Emilio Valenti, the man all of Chicago was afraid to look in the eye, stood in his own penthouse with a trembling hand as he held a small hard drive wrapped in plastic. Because inside that object was Franco's voice, Franco's books, proof that the man who had held him the night his mother died was the same man who had killed her. He set the drive back down on the table, gently, as if he were afraid it might break. Then he sat down, didn't speak. Hazel sat back in the chair across from him. She let him have the silence. She didn't rush him, didn't explain further, didn't try to fill the emptiness. She understood the silence of a person whose world had just been turned upside down. She had lived with that kind of silence for 5 years. When Emilio looked up, his eyes had changed. The shock was gone. In its place was something colder, sharper, something Tommy recognized instantly. An instinct made him straighten where he stood. Hazel continued, her voice even. There's one more thing you need to know. Franco knows you're reopening the investigation into your mother's death. Emilio narrowed his eyes. He hadn't told anyone about that, except the 3 private investigation teams he had hired over the past 5 years. And Tommy, Hazel said, Franco has someone inside your security team. I don't know who, but in the notes I gathered while tracking Franco over the past few years, I saw that he was receiving detailed reports on every move you made. Every time you hired a new investigation team, Franco knew within 48 hours. Every direction they followed, Franco knew before they found the results. That's why none of the teams found anything. Not because there was nothing to find, but because Franco erased the traces before they got there. Emilio looked at Tommy. Tommy looked back, his face drained white, and gave a small shake of his head. Not me. Emilio knew that. If it had been Tommy, he would have been dead a long time ago. But there were 6 other men on his team. Hazel still wasn't finished. And Franco is planning to kill you. She said it in a flat voice, as if she were reading a weather report. Not because she was cold, but because she had lived with that truth long enough that it no longer made her shake. Next week, you have a meeting with a Russian investment group at Willis Tower. Franco arranged that meeting. He's going to make it look like an accident. I don't know exactly how, but I know he's spoken to cartel people about it twice in the past month. Emilio leaned back in his chair. 5 years. For 5 years he had eaten alone every Friday night, staring through the glass, wondering who had killed his mother. For 5 years he had hired investigators and found nothing. For 5 years Franco had stood beside him, shared dinner with him, discussed business with him, called him brother. And through all 5 of those years, every move Emilio made had been watched. Every effort to find the truth had been crushed before it could even begin, by the very man sitting across from him in every meeting, by the same hand that had clapped his shoulder whenever he came close to giving up. Franco hadn't only betrayed him. Franco had lived inside that betrayal every single day for 5 years without blinking. Emilio looked at the hard drive on the table, looked at Hazel, looked at Titan beneath the table. Then he said 2 words to Tommy. Call Mercer. They left the penthouse at 2 a.m. Emilio didn't want to move Hazel and Titan while the city was still awake, while there were still eyes on the streets and cameras at every intersection that could record who was sitting in which car. Tommy drove the black SUV with no personal plates, the kind of vehicle Emilio's team used for trips that didn't exist on any schedule. Hazel sat in the back seat, Titan lying at her feet, his head resting on her torn shoes. She didn't ask where they were going. She was used to not asking, used to letting other people decide where she would be that night. Except this time the person deciding wasn't a shelter worker or the manager of a temporary home, but the Mafia boss in the front seat, staring through the windshield without saying a single word during the entire 40-minute drive. Lake Forest lay about 50 minutes north of Chicago, a place where mansions hid behind tall gates and old trees, where the nearest neighbors were 100 meters apart, and no one asked questions about anyone else. The estate Tommy took them to stood at the end of an unnamed road, registered under a shell company name that would have taken even the FBI months to trace back to its real owner. 2 stories, gray stone walls, bullet-resistant windows, a security system Emilio had installed 3 years earlier for situations he had hoped would never happen. 4 guards were already there before they arrived, all of them Tommy's men Tommy had chosen himself, rather than taken from Emilio's main team. Because now they knew the main team had an informant, and until they found out who it was, no one on that team was allowed to know Hazel existed. Emilio led Hazel inside and showed her the bedroom on the 2nd floor, then said simply, "You're staying here. There will be guards 24/7. If you need anything, tell Tommy." Then he turned away. Hazel stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched his back without calling after him. She stepped into the room. A large bed, white sheets, more pillows than she needed. A window looking out over the darkened back garden. An empty closet. A private bathroom with a stone bathtub and a glass shower. Titan dragged himself in after her and lay down beside the bed, his nose touching her foot. Hazel walked into the bathroom, closed the door, stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror for the first time in a very long while. The face in the mirror was thinner than she remembered, cheekbones sharper, dark circles deep beneath her eyes, reddish-brown hair dry and tangled. She didn't look for long. She stepped to the shower and turned on the hot water. At first, the water ran cold, then warm, then hot. Steam began to rise. Hazel put her hand under the stream and kept it there. 6 months. 6 months since the last time she had felt hot water. At the shelter, there was only lukewarm water, and the showers were timed, 15 minutes for each person. Not enough to truly feel clean. Before the shelter, when she was sleeping on the street, there had been nothing. She stepped into the shower and stood there. Didn't move, just stood beneath the hot water and let it run through her hair, over her face, down her back, over every place on her body that for 3 years had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. 30 minutes. She stood there for 30 minutes. The water ran down the drain carrying away dirt, exhaustion, and one small part of something heavier than dirt that she couldn't quite name. When she stepped out, her wet reddish-brown hair clung darkly to her neck, her eyes slightly red from the heat and steam, and something had changed in her face. Not joy. Not yet. Relief. The kind of relief that appears only when someone sets down a burden they have carried for so long they forgot they were carrying it. She put on the clothes someone had left on the bed for her, a white t-shirt and cotton pants, simple clothes but clean, new, and smelling of fresh laundry. She lay down on the bed. Titan immediately lifted his head and placed it back on her legs, that heavy, warm head resting against her shins, the same way it had rested on Emilio's shoes on the first night at Solace. But this time it wasn't because of exhaustion, not because of hunger. It was because of peace, because the dog had found the person he had been looking for, and that person was here, and tonight there was no need to be afraid. Hazel placed her hand on Titan's head, closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, both of them truly slept. Emilio came to Lake Forest every evening. He didn't tell Hazel he was coming, didn't set a time, didn't give warning. He just came. He drove alone from the penthouse north after finishing work, parked in the private garage, and walked into the house at 8 or 9 at night. Tommy said it wasn't safe for the boss to drive alone, but Emilio didn't listen. There were some drives he needed to make without anyone beside him. On the first night, the two of them sat in the living room on the first floor. Hazel in the armchair by the window, Emilio on the sofa across from her, Titan lying between them on the rug. No one said anything for about 20 minutes. Then Hazel began to talk, not because Emilio asked, but because she saw the way he sat there, a glass of whiskey in his hand without drinking it, his eyes fixed somewhere far away, and she realized he was thinking about Renata. She said, "She used to sing when she cooked." Emilio looked at her. Hazel continued, "Not loudly, only enough to hear if you were standing in the kitchen. All old songs. Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, the kind of music she said her husband loved when he was alive. She made tomato sauce from scratch, never used anything from a can. And while waiting for the sauce to simmer, she would lean against the stove, legs crossed, singing, 'That's Amore,' so softly it was almost a whisper." Emilio didn't say anything, but he set the whiskey down and listened. From that night on, Hazel told him something every evening. Each story was a piece of Renata Emilio had never seen. She laughed with her whole body when she heard a bad joke, the kind of laugh that made her shoulders shake, her eyes close, and took a full minute to stop. She watched Hallmark movies every Sunday night and cried at the ending even though she knew the ending would be happy. And when Hazel looked at her, she would turn away to wipe her eyes and say the wind had gotten in them. Inside the house, in the middle of summer, she spoke about her son in a voice Hazel had never heard anyone use for anyone else, full of pride and worry and longing all at once, as if he were very far away even when he was only a few miles away. Emilio listened to everything. His jaw tightened at some parts, eased at others. He didn't cry, but Hazel saw the way his hand curled into a fist on his thigh whenever she told him something that made him realize what he had missed. He had loved his mother all his life, and never known this version of her. Renata in the kitchen, singing Dean Martin. Renata crying at movies and pretending she wasn't. Renata sitting in the waiting room of a veterinary clinic every Tuesday night because she was lonely enough to need a 22-year-old student to talk to. Through Hazel, he was meeting his mother again, through the angle he had never gotten to have, and it hurt and healed at the same time, in the way only real things can. On the fourth night in Lake Forest, Hazel pulled a black moleskin notebook from her old backpack, the cover peeling and patched with clear tape. She placed it on the coffee table between them without saying a word. Emilio opened it. Inside were 5 years of observation. Franco's movements recorded by day, by week, by month. License plates of the cars Franco's men used, including the vehicles they switched with the seasons. Hand-drawn pencil maps of the buildings Franco visited often, with notes on entrances, cameras, and guard schedules. The names and physical descriptions of at least 12 people she had seen Franco meet regularly. A rough but precise map of the laundering route she had pieced together from what she observed on the street, combined with the data from the hard drive she had memorized before sewing it into her coat. Emilio turned each page in silence. Every page was neat, detailed, patient. This wasn't the work of someone paranoid or desperate. It was the work of an observer, with method, with purpose, with discipline. He looked up. "You did all of this while living on the street." Hazel gave a faint shrug. "On the street, people who don't observe don't survive." Emilio looked at her longer than usual. She had done more than the 3 private investigation teams he had hired with hundreds of thousands of dollars over 5 years. Alone, without money, without technology, without power, only with her eyes and a notebook. He closed the moleskin and set it back on the table. He didn't say thank you. Emilio wasn't the kind of man who said thank you, but the next night when he came to Lake Forest, he brought a small box. Inside was a collar for Titan, real leather, dark brown, with a steel buckle, and on the inside engraved with one word, Titan. He didn't hand it to Hazel. He placed the box on the coffee table, in the same place where she had set the moleskin the night before, and gave no explanation. Hazel opened the box, took out the collar. Her fingers moved along the leather and stopped where the name had been engraved. She didn't say thank you, but she looked up and looked at Emilio. That look lasted only a few seconds, but it held more than gratitude. It held recognition. Recognition that the man sitting in front of her, the man the world called a monster, had taken time out of his day to have a collar made with her dog's name engraved on it, not because he needed anything from her, not because of strategy, but because he understood that Titan having a name meant Titan had an owner, and Hazel needed to know that no one was ever going to take her dog again. Hazel put the collar on Titan. The dog sniffed the new collar, licked her hand, then lay down between them. No one said anything else that night. But when Emilio left, Hazel stood at the door and watched his car for the first time. And Emilio, glancing into the rearview mirror, saw her standing there, her hand resting on Titan's head, the porch light shining behind her. He didn't know what to call what was beginning between them. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't desire. It was the slow recognition that the other person understood the kind of darkness you lived inside. Not because it had been explained, but because they had walked through it themselves. Conrad Mercer arrived in Lake Forest on the 6th day. He was 62 years old, with silver hair cut close, and a back so straight, he still looked like a man in uniform, even though he had been retired for 4 years. 28 years in the FBI, commander of the organized crime unit in Chicago, the man who had put 3 cartel bosses in federal prison before leaving the bureau. Emilio knew him through a deal neither side would ever mention again, the kind of relationship that exists in Chicago between men who stand on opposite sides of the law, but understand that sometimes both sides need the same thing. Emilio called Mercer for one simple reason. Franco had someone inside the Chicago police. Anyone in the normal justice system could be a link Franco controlled. Mercer was outside the system. He no longer belonged to anyone, and he was the only man Emilio knew who could build a recording operation without going through any agency at all. Mercer sat at the dining table in the Lake Forest estate, listened to Emilio speak for 15 minutes, studied Hazel's moleskin for 20 minutes, plugged the hard drive into his own laptop, and read the data for 45 minutes. When he looked up, his face hadn't changed, but his eyes had. He said enough. No need for more. He looked at Hazel, sitting in the armchair at the corner of the room with Titan at her feet, and said in a dry voice that still carried respect, "You've done more than half my old unit ever did, Miss Brennan." The plan was built over 3 days. Mercer brought 4 of his own men, all former federal agents, none of them still active in the system, none of them connected to the Chicago police. The recording devices were the smallest on the market, the size of a shirt button, with a 15-meter pickup range in an enclosed space, clear enough to be used as evidence in federal court. Emilio would wear one on the lapel of his suit. Hazel would carry the second. The meeting with the Russian investment group at Willis Tower had been arranged by Franco for Tuesday night the following week, in a private conference room on the 67th floor. Emilio would arrive on time, behave completely normally, and give Franco no sign that anything had changed. Mercer explained why. Men like Franco Bianchi can't resist showing off when they think they've won. When he believes everything is in his hands, when he's holding the gun and looking into the eyes of the man he's about to kill, he will talk. They always talk. Not because they need to, but because 20 years of being number 2 has created something inside Franco that needs to be heard, needs to know the other man understands he has lost. Hazel was the one who solved the hardest problem: how to get the second recorder into the building without going through the main security system. She opened the moleskin to a page near the end, where there was a hand-drawn diagram of Willis Tower she had made during the years she spent tracking Franco. She pointed to the mechanical level above the 67th floor, the floor used for the air conditioning systems and ventilation shafts. There was an access point from the maintenance stairwell on the east side of the building, the one cleaning staff used after 10 at night. She knew the maintenance schedule because she had watched the building many times while tracking Franco in and out. From the mechanical level, the ventilation system ran between floors, wide enough for a small person to move through if they knew the route. She would go in before the meeting began, position herself inside the ventilation system above the conference room, and record everything with the second device. If anything went wrong, she would activate the satellite phone Mercer provided, the kind that didn't go through a normal mobile network, the signal going straight to a satellite and impossible to block or trace. Mercer looked at Hazel while she laid out the plan. Then he looked at Emilio. Emilio looked back at Hazel. She sat there with the battered notebook in her hands, describing the layout of a 70-story building from memory without looking back at her notes, her voice calm, her eyes clear, and he thought that if someone had lived on the streets for 5 years and still kept that kind of sharpness, then that person was either extraordinary or driven by something stronger than survival instinct itself. He knew what that something was. A promise to Renata. Tuesday came, late afternoon. Emilio changed into a suit at the penthouse, the charcoal 3-piece suit he wore for important meetings. The recorder, no larger than a shirt button, had been fixed to his left lapel by Mercer that morning. He drove to Lake Forest one last time before everything began. Hazel stood at the front door of the estate. She was wearing black pants, a dark long-sleeved top, her hair pulled back neatly, and soft-soled shoes that made no sound, shoes Mercer had prepared for her. She had the second recording device on her, and the satellite phone. Titan sat beside her, his head level with her hip, looking at Emilio with calm, dark brown eyes. "Are you afraid?" Hazel asked. "No." She looked at him for a long moment, not to check whether he was telling the truth, but as if she were memorizing his face in case this was the last time. "I am," she said, "but I'm still going." Emilio had already turned away and taken 2 steps toward the car. He stopped, turned back, walked up to Hazel, placed his hand against her cheek. His warm palm touched her hollow cheek, his thumb brushing lightly across the cheekbone. He didn't say anything. Hazel didn't pull away, didn't close her eyes, didn't move. She just stood there and let his hand rest against her face for 3 or 4 seconds that both of them knew said more than any words they still weren't ready to speak. Then Emilio lowered his hand, turned away, got into the car, and drove into the night. Emilio walked into the Willis Tower lobby at 9 at night with the face he had spent 20 years perfecting, a face that gave away nothing. Charcoal gray suit, white shirt, no tie, black polished Oxford shoes reflecting the lobby lights. The recorder, no bigger than a shirt button, sat on his left lapel, nearly invisible. He shook hands with the receptionist, stepped into the private elevator to the 67th floor, and when the elevator doors opened, Franco Bianchi was already standing there waiting for him with the smile Emilio had once believed was the smile of a brother. Franco looked the way he always did, black suit, slicked back hair, a Patek Philippe on his left wrist. His voice warm and eager as he clapped Emilio on the shoulder and said the Russians were very interested, that the South Loop Hotel project could change the game for both of them. Emilio nodded, smiled the right amount, and shook hands with the 3 Russian investors sitting inside the glass-walled conference room with its sweeping view of Chicago at night. The meeting began normally. Numbers, projects, projected profits. Franco presented smoothly, confidently, professionally. But Emilio noticed something he would have missed before. Franco glanced at his watch. Not obviously, not often, only a few times. Quick, with his eyes rather than turning his wrist. He was waiting for a moment. 2 floors above, inside the ventilation system of the mechanical level, Hazel moved. She had entered the building at 7 that evening through the east maintenance stairwell exactly as planned, reaching the mechanical floor before the night security shift began. The space inside the air duct was tighter than she had imagined. Total darkness except for thin slivers of light slipping through the vents into the floors below. The smell of metal dust and machine oil. She crawled on her elbows and knees, centimeter by centimeter, controlling her breathing, controlling every movement so she wouldn't make a sound on the thin sheet of metal beneath her. She had made it about 2/3 of the way when she heard footsteps, directly below. Shoes on tile, steady, slow, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone on patrol rather than simply walking past. One of Franco's private guards. Hazel froze completely, flattened against the metal duct, face down, both hands gripping the sides, holding her breath. The footsteps passed directly beneath the vent where she lay. If the man looked up, if there was any sound at all, everything was over. She counted in her head. 1, 2, 3, counted to 40. The footsteps moved farther away, turned a corner, disappeared. Hazel exhaled slowly, carefully, through her nose. Her heart was beating so hard she thought the sound of it had to be echoing through the metal duct. She kept crawling. Below, in the conference room on the 67th floor, the meeting with the Russians ended at 11. Handshakes, business cards exchanged, promises to meet again. When the last investor stepped into the elevator, Franco turned to Emilio. The smile was still there, but his eyes had changed. "Brother, can we step into the office for a minute? Important call. I want you to hear it too." Emilio knew this was the moment. He nodded and followed Franco into the private office at the end of the hallway. The room was smaller than the conference room, with an oak desk, leather chairs, and windows facing west. Franco closed the door. The click of the lock, and the smile disappeared, completely. Franco's face changed in less than a second, from the brother Emilio had known for 20 years into someone he had never met at all. Cold, calculating, and with nothing behind his eyes except emptiness. Franco stepped behind the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a handgun, pointed it straight at Emilio's chest. Emilio didn't move. Up on the mechanical level, Hazel had reached the position directly above the office. Her face pressed to the vent, the recorder running. Franco began to talk, and once he started, he didn't stop, as if the lid had finally blown off something he had held down for 20 years. He talked about Sinaloa cartel money, hundreds of millions flowing through the restaurants and real estate the two of them co-owned. Talked about how he had built the network starting at 30, while Emilio was busy expanding the legitimate front. Franco was expanding the empire underneath it. He talked about envy, 20 years of always being the man behind someone else, always being Emilio's Franco instead of his own man, 20 years of newspapers printing the name Emilio Valenti, while Franco Bianchi was nothing but a line at the bottom of the article. Then he talked about Renata. His voice didn't change when he reached this part, and that lack of change was what made it terrifying. He described the night he planted the bomb in the same flat tone someone might use to describe a business deal. She found the books while cleaning the office over the weekend. She recorded my calls. She said she'd tell you. I had no other choice. Emilio stood motionless, the gun aimed at his chest, listening to his brother explain how he had killed his mother. Franco went on. He revealed the name of the informant, Vince Darrow, a bodyguard on Emilio's team, bought by Franco 3 years earlier. Every report on Emilio's investigations had gone through Darrow. And Franco also talked about the vet girl. The old woman gave her something before she died. I knew about that girl long before Darrow joined us, because I had my men follow Renata every Tuesday to that clinic. I had my people track her down, destroy her career, take her dog. But the girl disappeared. My men looked for 2 years and never found her. Franco gave a shrug. Doesn't matter anymore. After tonight, there won't be anyone left to worry about. Franco raised the gun until it was level with Emilio's chest. His finger tightened halfway on the trigger. He was looking at Emilio with the eyes of a man who had made this decision long ago and was only savoring the final moment before the end. Emilio looked straight at the gun. Then he said, his voice calm in a way that felt almost unnatural for a man standing in front of a weapon, I know, Hazel. 2 words, and Franco's face changed completely. The color drained from his skin, rising from his neck to his face. The gun shifted 2 inches offline. Not much, but enough for Emilio to know he had struck exactly the right place. Franco opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the office door opened. Not kicked in, not forced. It opened normally, by the handle, from the outside. Hazel stepped in. She looked small against the room, against the doorway, against the 2 men standing face to face with a gun between them. But her back was straight. Her eyes were clear, and in her right hand was the recorder, the red light still blinking, having captured every word Franco had spoken over the last 15 minutes. Behind Hazel, Conrad Mercer entered with 4 former agents, all armed, all in black suits, all already in position outside the office, from the moment Franco had shut the door. Mercer had heard everything through the device on Emilio's lapel. He had waited until Franco said enough. Now it was enough. Franco looked at Hazel, looked at the recorder, looked at Mercer and the 4 men with guns pointed at him, and in that instant, something broke inside Franco Bianchi. Not regret. Rage. The rage of a man realizing he had been defeated by the very thing he thought he had already destroyed. The vet girl. He swung the gun toward Hazel. Emilio didn't think. His body reacted before his mind could give the order. 20 years in a world where half a second of delay was the difference between life and death. He lunged at Franco from the side, his right shoulder slamming into Franco's ribs, and both men crashed to the floor. The gun flew from Franco's hand and skidded across the wooden floor toward the leg of the desk. Emilio pinned Franco down, one hand locking his wrist, his knee driving Franco's shoulder into the floor. Franco fought, but Emilio was heavier, and the anger inside him now wasn't the kind that lost control. It was the cold, precise kind, the kind he had forged over 20 years. 2 of Mercer's agents reached them within 3 seconds. One pulled Emilio off. The other flipped Franco face down and cuffed his hands behind his back. The click of steel cuffs rang through the silent room. Franco started shouting. Not begging, not explaining, threatening. You think this is over? The cartel won't let this go. You die. The girl dies. Everybody dies. You don't know what you're touching. His voice filled the room, sharp and high. The voice of a man losing control and knowing he was losing control. Mercer signaled for the agents to haul Franco to his feet. He was still shouting when they dragged him to the door. Still shouting when they took him into the elevator. His voice echoing down the hallway until the elevator doors shut and everything went silent. Emilio got up from the floor. His suit was wrinkled, his hair out of place, his right hand aching from striking the floor in the fall. He stood in the middle of the office, breathing hard, and looked at Hazel. She was still standing by the door, still holding the recorder in her hand. She was trembling slightly. Emilio could see her shoulders shaking, but she didn't step back, didn't sit down, didn't collapse. She stood there, small and trembling but upright, and in her eyes was something Emilio recognized, because he was feeling the same thing himself: lightness. For the first time in 5 years, something in his chest felt lighter. Not joy, not victory. The feeling that his mother could finally rest, that the truth had finally been spoken aloud and captured, and no one could erase it anymore. At that same moment, downstairs, Tommy was handling the final piece. Vince Darrow, the man Franco had just named in his confession, was caught by Tommy in the hallway on the 65th floor trying to make a phone call. Tommy had been watching Darrow from the moment the meeting began, keeping enough distance not to be noticed, staying close enough to move when he had to. When Darrow lifted the phone to his ear, Tommy stepped out from the corner of the hall, ripped the phone from his hand, and slammed him against the wall. Darrow didn't fight. He looked at Tommy's face and understood that everything was over. On the phone screen, the number he had been calling belonged to one of Franco's closest men. Emilio walked over to Hazel, stood in front of her, said nothing. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Then he nodded once, slowly. And Hazel understood what that nod meant, because by now she knew him well enough to read the things he never said aloud. It said, "It's over." 4 months after the night at Willis Tower, Emilio sat in the 3rd row of the courtroom inside the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago. A federal courtroom isn't like the movies. There is no drama, no warm golden light, only high ceilings, dark oak, fluorescent lights, and the heavy silence of a place where words can close or open the doors of a prison. Franco Bianchi sat at the defendant's table, an orange prison uniform in place of his tailored black suit, handcuffed, with 2 federal marshals standing on either side of him. He didn't look at Emilio, didn't look at anyone. He only stared straight ahead with the empty eyes of a man who had lost everything and knew he had lost it. Hazel sat beside Emilio. Navy blue dress, neatly brushed hair, new shoes. She looked so different from the woman Tommy had found in the Englewood shelter 4 months earlier. Her cheekbones were no longer sharply hollow. The dark circles were gone from beneath her eyes, but the biggest change wasn't in her appearance. It was in the way she sat. Back straight, shoulders open, not folded in on herself, not trying to make herself smaller. She sat like someone who had the right to be there. Then she did something she hadn't done once in the past 4 months. She reached out and took Emilio's hand, on her own. Not because he touched her first, not because danger forced them together. She simply placed her left hand over his right hand resting on his thigh, and held it. Emilio looked down at their hands, said nothing, didn't pull away. He only curled his fingers around hers. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. The evidence Renata had gathered on the hard drive and Hazel had protected for 5 years was presented in full. The double books, the recordings of calls between Franco and people from the Sinaloa cartel, the Cayman Islands account numbers, the recording from the night at Willis Tower, Franco's voice confessing everything, was played in the courtroom. When Franco's voice came through the speakers describing how he planted the bomb in Renata's car, Emilio felt Hazel tighten her grip on his hand. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her, but their hands spoke for them. The expanded investigation after Franco's arrest uncovered a network larger than anyone had imagined. 14 offshore accounts, 6 Chicago police officers involved, 2 officials from the Illinois Department of Health, including the one who had signed the order revoking Hazel's license. 1 state judge had been bought. The federal indictment ran more than 200 pages. On the night before sentencing, the 2 of them sat eating dinner at the Lake Forest estate. Hazel pushed the food around on her plate, turning a piece of meat back and forth with her fork, without raising it to her mouth. Emilio noticed and waited. He had learned that with Hazel, waiting always worked better than asking. "What if they don't believe me?" She said it while still looking at her plate. "They already did," Emilio answered. "You testified beautifully. But what if it isn't enough?" Emilio set down his knife and fork, looked at her. No matter what happens, you brought the truth into the light. That alone is more than enough. Hazel nodded slowly, then kept moving the food around. Emilio was about to say something more, but stopped. The silence between them had long since learned how to become comfortable, and he knew there were moments when silence should be allowed to take the space. That night, Titan lay beneath the dining table, his head resting on Hazel's foot, sleeping peacefully while the two of them sat quietly together until Hazel finally managed to eat a few bites. The next day, at the Dirksen building, the judge read each charge in a level, emotionless voice, exactly the way justice should be spoken. Guilty of intentional first-degree murder. Guilty of federal money laundering. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Life in prison. No parole. Hazel gripped Emilio's hand tighter. There was no joy in that moment. No triumph. Only justice, heavy and clean. After leaving the courthouse, Emilio drove alone toward the north side of the city. He didn't tell Hazel where he was going. She didn't ask. Rose Hill Cemetery lay in a quiet part of northern Chicago, where old oak and maple trees rose higher than the buildings around them, and the small roads between the graves rarely saw visitors on a weekday afternoon. Emilio parked a block away from the gate and walked. He needed to arrive slowly, needed that stretch of sidewalk, each step of it, to prepare for something he had not been able to do in 5 years. Speak to his mother without carrying the question of who had killed her. Renata's headstone was simple. Pale gray granite, her name, 2 dates. Beside the stone stood a vase of fresh flowers someone had left recently. White daisies, the kind sold in an ordinary flower shop. Not expensive, but fresh. Emilio looked at the flowers and knew immediately. Hazel had come 3 days earlier. She had asked him to stop the car at the cemetery gate and wait in the car, without saying why. He hadn't asked. He stood in front of his mother's grave. The afternoon wind moved softly, stirring the flowers in the vase. He began to speak. His voice was low, only loud enough for himself to hear. He said Franco's name. Said it aloud in this place for the first time. Said that it was hard to accept, but it was the truth. And truth, no matter how painful, is the only ground strong enough to stand on. He told her about Hazel. Said she was extraordinary. Said she had kept her promise to Emilio's mother for 5 years, when she had nothing left. No home, no name, no future. Said she had the kind of courage Renata had always wanted him to have. The quiet kind that doesn't need anyone to see it. Said he was taking care of her. Said he would keep doing so. He stood there in silence for a long time after that. The wind still moved the flowers. Some bird sounded in a nearby tree. Emilio drew in a deep breath. The first real deep breath he had taken in weeks. The kind of breath that opens the chest completely and lets the air reach all the way to the bottom of the lungs. And when he turned away, he knew he was leaving something behind in that place. Not all of the pain, because pain doesn't vanish all at once, but part of the weight, the part he had been carrying without even knowing he was still carrying it. 6 months after the trial, the Illinois Department of Health sent a letter to the Lake Forest estate. Hazel opened the envelope at the kitchen table. Titan lying at her feet. Emilio sitting across from her drinking his morning coffee. She read the letter twice, then set it down on the table, her face expressionless, but her hands trembling. Her veterinary license had been fully restored. The accusation that she had stolen opioids 5 years earlier had been officially dismissed after 2 Department of Health officials tied to Franco's network were federally prosecuted. Hazel Brennan's record had been wiped clean. She looked at Emilio. He looked at her. Neither of them said congratulations or finally it's over. Emilio only nodded once. Slowly. The kind of nod Hazel had long since learned to read. The kind that said, I know what this means to you and I'm here. 3 months later, Hazel opened a new veterinary clinic on the south side. Not in an expensive neighborhood. Not in the Gold Coast or Lincoln Park. The south side. The very street where the old clinic stood. The one where she used to work evening shifts. Where Renata Valenti had first walked in with a tabby cat and a box of cannoli. She chose that place on purpose. Emilio didn't ask why, because he already knew. Around the same time, Emilio began the process he had never imagined he would undertake. He started making the empire legitimate, not overnight, not completely, but piece by piece, one deal at a time, moving the money stream from darkness into light. He founded the Renata Valenti Foundation, legal support for women who had been falsely accused and lost their careers. free veterinary care for low-income communities in the South Side and Englewood. The idea for the foundation came from Hazel. One afternoon, when the two of them were driving past the Englewood shelter where she had once lived, Hazel looked out the window and saw a young woman sitting on the sidewalk holding a thin cat. She didn't say anything for 10 minutes. Then, without looking at Emilio, her eyes still turned outside, she said, "There are a lot of people like me out there, and most of them don't have an Emilio Valenti to walk in." Emilio didn't answer then, but the next week, his lawyer received instructions to establish the foundation. One morning, Hazel brought home her official veterinary certificate to the penthouse, the framed kind with the red seal of the state of Illinois. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at Emilio with a look he recognized immediately. The look of someone waiting for a reaction without wanting to admit she was waiting. He said he was proud of her. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you have a fridge magnet?" Emilio didn't understand. Hazel told him that when she was little, every time she got a good grade in school, her grandmother Dolores would pin the test to the refrigerator with magnets bought at the flea market, the cheap plastic kind shaped like fruit, or the state of Illinois that people sold for $2 each. That was Dolores's way of saying she was proud. The next day, Emilio drove to the Maxwell Street Market and bought a magnet, the shape of the state of Illinois, cheap plastic, the kind nobody bought as a gift. He brought it back to the penthouse and pinned Hazel's veterinary certificate to the $15,000 Sub-Zero refrigerator with that $2 magnet. Hazel looked at the certificate hanging on the refrigerator. Then she laughed. Not a small laugh, not a soft laugh. She laughed with her whole body, shoulders shaking, eyes closed, the kind of laugh that takes a full minute to stop. The same kind of laugh she had once told him Renata had whenever she heard a bad joke. It was the first time Emilio had ever heard Hazel laugh like that. Not worried, not controlled, not holding any part of herself back. And it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in years. Titan was between them every day. The dog slept between them on the sofa every evening when they watched the news. He went with Emilio to Solace every Friday and lay on the special mat Tommy kept beside the familiar corner table. He went with Hazel to the clinic every morning and lay in the waiting room, head resting on his front paws, watching patients come and go with calm, dark brown eyes. Children from the neighborhood came to the clinic sometimes not because their pets were sick, but just to pet Titan's head. One Saturday evening, they sat on the penthouse terrace. The Chicago skyline stretched out in front of them, orange-yellow lights against the dark sky, the kind of view people put on postcards, even though no postcard ever captures the feeling of cold October wind on the skin, and the smell of the city folded into the night air. Dinner was over. Titan slept beneath the table, his head resting on Hazel's foot, exactly where he had chosen to lie from the night of their reunion, and never changed again. Emilio looked at Hazel. She was looking out at the city, her reddish-brown hair moving lightly in the wind, and he thought she was most beautiful when she didn't know she was being watched. He pulled a small black velvet box from the inside pocket of his jacket, set it on the table between them. Hazel looked at the box, looked at him. "My mother always used to say something," Emilio said, his voice lower than usual. "She said, when you find the person who makes you want to become a better man, don't let them go. I let my mother go without telling her I loved her one last time. I won't make that mistake twice." Hazel opened the box. The ring inside was simple, not the kind with an enormous diamond people would expect a Chicago boss to buy. White gold, one small stone, elegant. Emilio had chosen it because it looked like Hazel, not needing display to have value. Hazel looked at the ring, looked at Emilio, looked down at Titan sleeping at her feet. Then she said, "That dog collapsed at your feet, starving, and led you to me. Maybe Renata sent him." Emilio smiled. The first smile in 5 years that reached his eyes. Not a polite smile, not a social smile, but a real one. The kind of smile he had thought he had forgotten how to make since the night he stood on the sidewalk in Lincoln Park, staring at the burned black frame of his mother's car. "Yes," he said. Hazel slipped the ring onto her finger. Titan slept at her feet, breathing steadily, knowing nothing about the moment unfolding above him. But the dog didn't need to know. He had already done his part from the night he dragged himself through the kitchen door of Solace and collapsed at the exact feet that needed healing. The girl who had once lived on the street with a secret sewn into the lining of her coat, and the boss who used to sit alone every Friday night staring through the glass at something that was no longer there, those two people had found each other because a starving dog chose the right place to fall. True love doesn't die. It changes shape and always finds its way home. Maybe the greatest lesson in this story isn't about the mafia, or secrets, or betrayal. Maybe it's about how sometimes the best things in life come out of the darkest moments. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but being afraid and going anyway. That family doesn't have to be blood, but can be a stranger collapsing at your feet and trusting you for no reason. That justice sometimes comes late, but if you don't give up, it comes. And that love, no matter how deeply it is hidden, stolen, or buried, always finds its way back. If this story touched you in any way, please hit the like button to support us. Share this video with someone you love or someone you know needs to hear that things are going to be okay, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories we share every day. I'd really love to know how this story made you feel. Which moment touched you the most? Do you believe that in real life, in the middle of so much darkness and injustice, there are still starving dogs that find the right person, still Hazels who keep their promise even after losing everything, still Emilios who learn how to open their hearts after years of keeping them closed? Leave me a comment and let me know. I read every line and treasure every feeling you share from the depths of your heart. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a happy life, and peace in every single day. Thank you for being here. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.